Welcome to my panelists today. We are really excited for this panel. This is part of the Sudan Global Entrepreneurship Week with the theme Entrepreneurship for Everyone. The week started on the 26th with online and offline events. We had events in Kasala, Gadarif, and we had online events. We had business clinics, webinars, and tomorrow we will have investment readiness training for businesses, and we will have another panel also about investments as part of the Beyond Capital Summit. This panel is about investing in Sudanese resilience and revival through Diaspora Capital. I have a very interesting panel today. I'll start introducing my panelists. Abir Ibrahim, Associate Director for Regional and Geopolitical Affairs at the World Economic Forum. Hind Zaki is the Director of International Partnerships at the Qatar Research, Development and Innovation Council. Hussam Eltayeb is an impact investor with a focus on the African markets. He's also a strategic advisor to 249 startups. And last but not least, Magdi Amin is the managing partner and co-founder at Africa Renaissance Ventures. He's also a seasoned impact investor and economist. Welcome. Very lovely to have you today, and excited to hear your thoughts and contributions. And for the next hour, we will be speaking to the panel, and we will have half an hour at the end for questions from the audience. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. And let's get started. I want to start with you, Hind. Let's just set the scene, and if you can tell us from your perspective what do you think the diaspora are capable of doing and can contribute in the current circumstances, specifically to support the entrepreneurship ecosystem in Sudan.
Thank you, Shimaa. Thanks for having me for this wonderful opportunity. I love to tap into the Sudanese startup ecosystem and support it as much as possible. So I've been in the diaspora, I would say, for many years now, and as part of the diaspora. And what I would say, thinking about my experiences working with startups in Sudan and entrepreneurs, I think there's many different things that the diaspora can do to support entrepreneurs, both in Sudan and outside of Sudan. And it's starting with wherever you are, you know a lot about your ecosystem, whether you're in the US, the UK, the Gulf countries. I myself have lived in Qatar now for 10 years, so you have a very strong knowledge about your ecosystem and the opportunities there and the investments opportunities there, accelerators, etc. So sharing information with entrepreneurs in Sudan, whether it's related to funding, whether it's related to market access, whether it's related to accelerators, incubators, etc. I think the simple starting point is being aware of that ecosystem and what opportunities are there for Sudanese entrepreneurs and startups to tap into and access. I think taking on mentorship roles is another opportunity that the diaspora can take. I've had a few mentors. I've had the honor to be a mentor to some of the Sudanese entrepreneurs actually through 249. And it's a wonderful opportunity to learn about what's going on in the ecosystem, some of the challenges and opportunities that they have, but also support them in different ways. I may know potential customers for these entrepreneurs, funding opportunities, conferences that they can go to. I may know and I have discounts to these conferences, etc. So mentorship is really important for entrepreneurs. And I think that where you can be a mentor, this is a great help for them and giving them access. And I think, thirdly is also just volunteering your time to support and advise. If you're a sector expert, if you're a subject matter expert in one specific area, whether it be fintech, clean tech, health tech, that advice goes a long way for startups. So if you can be on the advisory board or support them with that technical expertise, that's a big stepping stone as well. So there's just a few things and roles that you can play, sitting in the diaspora to support the ecosystem.
Thank you very much. And it's refreshing to hear that you have been involved, and that you're also aware of a lot of members of the diaspora who have been involved and giving to the ecosystem in Sudan. I also want us to put more context into what's happening now in Sudan with the current situation. And Majdi, over to you, if you can tell us more about specifically with the current circumstances, with the instability, most of the country in a very difficult situation because of the war, and really the entrepreneurs are fighting in multiple fronts with the current circumstance, but also with the nascency of the ecosystem even before the conflict. So yeah, Majdi, if you can shed some light and tell us your thoughts about contributing as a member of the diaspora in the current circumstances, and what can that look like?
Thank you. First of all, thank you to yourself and to 249 and to Ahmed and the whole community and everybody who joined. That's a great question. We can spend a lot of time on the immense difficulties that every Sudanese is facing. Everybody has somebody who's been affected, displaced. Many have lost lives, and we all know people in those circumstances. But let me also try to flip it a little bit. First of all, in terms of context, the diaspora plays a huge role in venture globally. In Africa, I think there's a lot of startups, but I think it's over a third of founders are diaspora returnees to Africa, people who have spent time outside of Africa and come back, many of them within Africa and come back. In the US, about a third of startups are also immigrant founders, but 55% of unicorns are immigrant founders. We all know, when people who are displaced, they land in a new place, they have to hustle. And there is a drive to make it, and there's an urgency, and that's a possible force. But I also think the change in perspective, the ability to see differently and to sort of look at a situation with somewhat fresh perspective and see, okay, well, here's a solution to a problem that I see. Maybe people have just absorbed the problem and live with it, but I see a different way forward. And so innovation happens, a lot of innovation happens as a result of that movement. And so, coming back to Sudan, I see the great challenges, but I see a huge opportunity. Unfortunately, the country was somewhat closed. It is a pretty solid engineering base, but had not, and a lot of people had not had the kind of exposure that now everybody's forced to have. Everybody's moved to a different location, has had to find a way forward, and is acquiring new skills. So if people are out there and they're building wherever they are, when the time comes, that will be a tremendous new force for economic growth in the Sudan. So like everybody else, when I was there, first of all, I am diaspora in the US. My family left Sudan when I was quite young, but when the opportunity came, I did go to Sudan to help in the transitional government. And one day I was heading off to work, the Abir, and the parking lot guy told me not to go because Hamdok was under arrest. And, everything we had done kind of fell apart. But I made a commitment to say, look, we're going to go around in circles unless we have a bigger middle class, companies that are growing, that are not politically connected, but are living and growing on their own merit. And that technology can play a key role in building Africa, and it already is. And so let me focus my efforts on funding those entrepreneurs. And most of my backers are also diaspora. You know, there's now some institutions, but many of the individual investors are diaspora. So I think diaspora wants to help. I think the opportunities is very large, and it's proven both within Africa and globally. And we can talk about remittances and other ways to help. But so long as those who have been displaced are gaining valuable experience and perspective, especially building, you know, including those who are helping other companies, should have some experience in the startup world, whether as investors, as builders, as advisors, because the opportunity for rebuilding Sudan even better is going to be there, and entrepreneurs will play a key role.
Thank you very much, Magdi. And I think you touched on a very important point. There is a big culture of giving in the Sudanese community. We are a very communal community, and whether in Sudan or diaspora, people love to contribute. And I think this is a very great foundation to build on. To this point, Hussam, I want to ask you, because a lot of the culture of contributing and giving is kind of almost selfless in the Sudanese community, and people think that by sending remittances to family or contributing by volunteering, that this is the only way they can help. And of course, to build a more sustainable, resilient ecosystem, specifically for entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs who are solving more complex problems in a more sustainable way, we need to change that mindset a little bit. Not to, of course, not to eliminate this approach, but to add to it. From your experience, how can this be done, and what tools can we leverage to achieve this?
Thank you, Shimaa, for that question. And also maybe just another round of thanks to 249 Startups for putting a much needed spotlight on these issues and with a positive spin. I think it's our duty as diaspora to stand beside our families, our mothers, our brothers, our sisters, wherever they are right now, be they in Egypt, be they in Uganda, be in all these other different countries. And I think, as you said, it's ingrained in our DNA to be generous. There is no two other ways about it. And I think this was definitely a fact before the war. You can even note there's many statistics that show that remittances was one of the key sources of hard currency available in Sudan and able to prop up the country. This is even more critical now today, where we have lots of our families and our people that we loved who have moved abroad and are, in one way or another, struggling to make ends. It takes a shift in culture, right? To go from wanting to simply provide and to give, which falls under philanthropy, right? And I think, that's what the world has been slowly transitioning from, because philanthropy feels good. You can be there, you can support people, but it is a zero-sum game. You end up not being able to generate real impact over the long term. And over time, what we found is people are migrating towards models such as impact investing. It's difficult to maybe overshadow that or overplay that in terms of when it comes to our commitments, because those commitments will not go away anytime soon. We will continue to be, needed to provide that backbone of support to our families, to our loved ones. But maybe what can shift over time is to think, how can I support them in being able to stand up on their own, in being able to have little small businesses? And a small business, it doesn't need to be something massive. It could be a small import-export business. And right now, if you go to Cairo, there's many small Sudanese businesses that are continuing to flourish or are starting to flourish. And I think we also need to bear in mind that it takes time to adapt. We're now coming up on maybe 2 years of this conflict. Right, that first year was maybe absorbed in people being in shock and not being able to sure where to go from there. Over time, people have become more accustomed to the new reality of living in Egypt or living in Uganda and what that means for them. Fortunately, some of them, also pressed due to circumstances, have either moved their existing businesses, relocated them, or have tried entrepreneurship for the first time. It could be something as simple as having a delivery service, or something as doing import-export from Sudan. At least that's one thing I definitely wanted to encourage in my family members, because otherwise you end up with this culture where there is a continuous pressure on the diaspora to be there and support, and inshallah we will be able to continue to do that, but it needs to be in a way where we feel like over time we are creating value. Because if we're not creating value, it just the pressures of living will continue to add. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Yeah, so certainly that definitely helps, and I think by doing this, we also help to solve these problems that our communities, our families are facing now. So instead of sending money so that my family can afford to buy the very, very expensive medicine, I can support a business that is a social business that is providing medicines in the time of scarcity. Thank you so much, Hussam. This was a very, very insightful answer. Abir, you are in a, let's say, a very important, powerful organization. And for the diaspora to be able to leverage their networks and their existence in places with resources that otherwise in Sudan are hard to access, how do you think this should be approached? What are the platforms that are out there that we can look to? Where do we start? And where can diaspora link up to in terms of these international forums, platforms, and organizations?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. Something Magdi said earlier, actually, that really resonated with me is the narrative of Sudan. It was very much misconstrued, or a lot of people are not very familiar with Sudan, or at least have very fragmented ideas of what Sudan looks like. And I think that really hindered Sudan's progress in a lot of ways, especially in these, as you mentioned, big, powerful platforms where narrative is very important. And a country that comes in mind is Rwanda. That was very good in how they approached their rehabilitation as a country, and the narrative became so important. They really dominated the media of promoting Rwandese products and the Rwandese narrative overall. So one way, at least for me, as I navigate these spaces, I realize the most important thing we all need to do, whether you are an entrepreneur in Sudan or you are someone who is leading investment portfolios or initiatives in international organizations, is how do we reshape that narrative through, social media is a very powerful tool that I believe a lot of us have access to. And I'm so happy and proud to see so many young Sudanese people are on these platforms promoting the Sudanese narrative so people can understand how that looks like. And how does that translate to real actionable investments? It's because when someone is familiar, for example, after the war broke out, a lot of people start to realize just how much the agricultural sector is massive in Sudan. Sudan is the largest agricultural country in Africa, something I didn't even know 5 years ago. I thought it would be South Africa or it'd be Nigeria, but no, Sudan by landmass is the largest, but a lot of it is untapped. A lot of countries are benefiting from that. So how do we as a Sudanese in Sudan or in a diaspora, if we're not directly leveraging that, we are at least creating or promoting that narrative. Now, when it comes to accessing resources, it becomes a bit tricky. And one thing I've learned in this space is that you really do have to do it yourself in a way. So I'll give you an example of Somalia. They have, maybe a lot of you are familiar with the Innovate Venture that they have created, which is a structure of mentorship that Hind mentioned earlier, and also being able to connect diaspora investors and funds to Sudanese on the ground, or Sudanese who are creating business opportunities in the continent or abroad that is benefiting Sudan at large. So this has become such a powerful way of, for example, me connecting with someone في الشمالية في Sudan, and maybe I am a software engineer in Dubai. So they are providing the expertise, but then someone in London or in the US is providing the fund seeding. I think there's a lot of ways for us to mobilize each other. And honestly, if we're not able to do that successfully, no international organization, no UN, no World Economic Forum, this is me just being very frank and transparent. I think the power and the resources are really within our community in finding ways to connect that. Another really great example that I came across recently was a Palestine Startup Weekend. Maybe you're familiar with it, which is essentially creating this virtual pitch competition, something similar to this model that we are chatting on right now, where we get access directly to entrepreneurs in Sudan, learning about their innovation, learning about what they're doing, whether it's someone in Kassala or someone connecting from Khartoum or Shimali or wherever you are right now. If I'm able to learn about what you're doing, maybe I would be interested to directly, fund your innovation, or at least mobilize my resources from my network directly to connect with you on the ground. So this is some of the ways that I find to be very practical. But if you also just want to expand your network, there are a lot of really great initiatives, part of the World Economic Forum, like the Global Shapers Program, which I believe there is a network in Sudan right now. I'm not sure how active it is, but through that network, we're able to mobilize early on when the war broke out, some mental health support and other resources to channel through it, connecting them with other global shapers, whether in Nigeria or in Rwanda or in South Africa. And if you are someone who's exceptional in what you're doing, it's also just reaching out to me or to other experts, because there are things that we're not able to share directly, but at least if we know about it, it helps us promote the narrative and it helps us connect you directly. So it's not as clear cut, but ultimately I will come down and double down on this narrative of mobilizing each other. And another point that Magdi made about remittances, if you look at just Sudan, $3 billion every year, I'm sure it's even more than that. That's what, 3% of the GDP. Imagine if a fraction of that just goes into these mentorship programs or transforming these local ideas. I think we really do have the power at the end of the day. And this is something that I will continue to drive. It's just really connecting. If I knew about it, I would support the same way that I feel like every professional in the diaspora would do the same. It's just really understanding the local context.
Thank you for being very action-oriented and very practical. And I think one of the most important things in such conversation like the one we're having today is to have actionable steps that people can take. And I also want to just point out to an angel network that 249 startup started a few years back, and members of the diaspora can reach out to 249 startups to receive training on becoming angel investors and on being part of the network. This is in effort to kind of bring people together and create this culture of investing in Sudanese startups, and also giving access to impactful companies and entrepreneurs. I do want to talk more about opportunities and being actionable, but I also want us to look at another region that's usually overlooked. When people think about diaspora, usually they think about Europe or America, but most Sudanese people actually live in the Gulf countries, most diaspora community. So Hind, if you can tell our audience about the regional resources that exist, how can they navigate the funding landscape in countries like Qatar or in general in the region? What advice can you give people who are actively looking for resources, funding, and even want to establish presence in the Gulf countries?
Thanks, Shimaa. I think as someone who's been living in Qatar, I think for 10 years now, I can talk about Qatar, but slightly more broadly about what's happening in the GCC, which is quite interesting. I think a lot of countries in the GCC are now, or for the last 5 to 10 years, have been talking about diversifying their economies. and thinking about diversifying away to some extent from oil and gas, but thinking about expanding the private sector, the role that the private sector plays, and more importantly, thinking about how the sector can be more innovative. And particularly the case in Qatar, we have a Qatar National Vision from 2008 and a Qatar National Development Strategy also. But I bring this up just because, you know, this pattern is happening in many countries across the GCC of how to attract top talent to these countries to help drive that diversification and also increase the number of innovative companies in these countries, whether they be startups, SMEs, large multinationals. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity for Sudanese startups because, you know, if you're a fantastic startup that is growing and these countries are of interest to you, you can think about expanding to some of these countries, finding more customers, finding more funding, mentorship, et cetera, and support. And you talked about kind of, you know, what support mechanisms are there, Shimaa, in these countries? I think, you know, we've talked about venture, obviously it's there, there's acceleration, but there's also grants that are available. So if you're a company that is, you know, an entrepreneur that's looking to increase your level of innovation and spend on R&D, product development and engineering, there are specific funding incentives and grants that are available to you if you are to come to these countries and expand or set up your kind of engineering team there. Now, I think what's tricky is just navigating these and understanding a bit more of them. And I would say people should reach out through their networks. We have, you know, Sudanese diaspora there are many of them in these countries. Reach out to them. Don't be afraid to kind of try and set up meetings and learn and do your homework about what is in these countries, what programs exist, what incentives exist, what is the eligibility for all of these programs. The one thing I'd say about Sudanese in general, you know, the kindness, but also the willingness to give your time. And I think everyone is willing to give their time to advise, to support in whatever way or form. And so I would say, you know, to entrepreneurs out there, you know, research, see what's out there, and feel free to approach people. But if you do that, I would say make sure you do your homework. What is your business case that you're proposing? What is your product? What is your solution? What is it targeting? And do your homework on that entity as well, and be very specific and clear about what is the ask. What are you asking for? Is it funding? Is it mentorship? Is it advice? All these things, because sometimes, I'll be honest, you know, I get approached sometimes and people are not clear what we do and they're not clear on what they want specifically, right? So the more homework you do up front, the more you know what you're looking for, the more you know kind of what you should be going after and what your ask is. So I think in a nutshell, that's kind of what I would advise. But in summary, there are many different programs, incentives, initiatives going on, particularly in the GCC. This is a very interesting time. So for example, Qatar in February of this year announced a $1 billion fund of fund to invest into the venture ecosystem. So that's going to inject quite a lot of capital into the country, and a lot of other GCC countries are doing similar things. So it's a very interesting time, but it's not so easy by just looking at Google, and you have to do your homework and you have to talk to people. But I think that's the one thing about the diaspora that is great, the Sudanese diaspora, is that they're willing to give their time, they're willing to answer questions and make time for people. So, you know, don't be shy, approach people and ask, and they'll be willing to give their time.
Definitely echo this advice, and I think one important thing to remind people is that yes, people are there to help you, but you also need to do your homework. So thank you for mentioning that, because people sometimes just go to people on LinkedIn just because they're from a similar background or they're Sudanese, and expect that they will give them all the answers, but you can't answer questions that are not formulated well. So formulate your questions, do your homework, and reach out, and I'm sure everyone on this panel and beyond will be very happy to help you. I just want to remind people of two things, that we do have interpretation if you prefer to listen to this panel in Arabic. حابة أذكر الناس إنه في ترجمة فورية، فلو حابين تستمعوا للبانل دي بالعربي ممكن تضغطوا على خيار الترجمة الفورية من إعدادات زوم. The second thing I want to remind people of is if you can put your questions in the Q&A. I see we already have a few questions that we will get to in about 20 minutes, but please do put your questions in the Q&A and we will hopefully get to them. Okay, back to actionable mechanisms for the diaspora to be involved in the entrepreneurship ecosystem in Sudan and support entrepreneurs. Magdi, you mentioned a lot of very good examples earlier in the panel, and you spoke about how important diaspora is in general, globally. From your experience, what has been some of the mechanisms that worked before? So I mentioned angel investment that 249 is championing, but what are some of the practical mechanisms that you've worked on or have seen that worked?
Okay, thank you. Well, the most important is when when you are displaced and you find yourself in a new environment, to acquire skills and experience and exposure. I can speak just so like for our portfolio, every one of them is a diaspora returnee who has come back to Africa and started something. Combination of having gotten education or experience abroad and then came back to their home country and built. There's one exception, and that is a founder who's foreign, but the rest are all African, but they all have had time abroad. So that's I think that's the most important thing, is to acquire skills, education and skills to come back and build. The second is in terms of funding. Some countries are more organized in doing that. Some countries are very good at linking their startups to the external ecosystem. So Nigeria is quite good, for example, at being able to tap into, and India as well, I think India is maybe even better, that tapping into their country's professionals in Silicon Valley or in Europe or in GCC or wherever they are, the professional networks that they have, they provide mentorship, the expertise and funding. So I think the angel network is very important. I think that that's a very good vehicle. I would advise those who are away from Sudan and those who are just diaspora permanently living outside of Sudan to get involved via, first of all, angel networks or funds, but not only because it's an investment. And there are ways to invest, retirement savings or other savings, just small amounts in terms of if there are angel checks, because you learn from that. And it's very important to have experience in watching the portfolio companies that you're investing in, how they evolve, what works, what doesn't work, and understand your investment preferences. I think it would be very helpful, and they may exist, to establish angel networks that invest in Sudanese founders, even if they're not in Sudan. As I was saying earlier, a lot of the best companies in the US, and there are funds who only invest in immigrant founders. Some of the best founders are people who are not in their home country, who have immigrated and have come to their new market and built, and they tend to be very good investments. So I think investing in, I know several companies that we were looking at or invested in have left Sudan and are now building somewhere else. Those I think would be good investments, not only now, but later when the opportunity arises in Sudan. But angel networks, we can do a lot more. There's a lot of networks that have built for humanitarian purposes. They're doing really important work. The other element that why that's important is because, frankly, for mainstream VC, Sudan will not be on the radar screen for a while. It wasn't before, but 85% of capital that goes to Africa in venture goes to 5 countries. So, you know, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and now Ghana. Morocco is doing well, but let's just be clear that it would be considered to be very high risk. But the diaspora knows that market and breaks through the unfamiliarity, because a lot of the risk perception comes because they simply don't know. So diaspora understands. They understand that Sudan is very rich with opportunity. And when startups come back, and typically in post-conflict scenarios, the startups are addressing basic needs. They're addressing gaps. There are huge gaps. And very often post-conflict growth is very high because it's bouncing back and filling those gaps. And technology will play a very key role in filling those gaps faster and reaching people where other, older methods will not work as well. So just to summarize, Sudan rising. I like Abir's focus on the narrative. There's a Africa rising narrative. There will be a Sudan rising narrative, but that's not going to happen unless people jump in and help. It'll happen when we as Sudanese decide it will happen, and we decide, and then we take action on it by first learning, acquiring skills, then mobilizing and investing. Sudanese founders inside or outside of Africa, but even just investing, if you're looking at and understanding and building, we will then be able to use those skills. And it's not just capital, it's capital and advice. It's really important to focus on the advice.
Thank you so much, Magdi. I really, really like the point about investing in Sudanese founders, even outside of Sudan, because a lot of these innovations that people create either contribute directly into the Sudanese economy or indirectly by supporting Sudanese immigrants in other countries. Thank you so much. This was a very, very insightful answer. Abir, I want to go back to you because as an advocate of gender equality, you are very, very aware of the difficulties that women face in general in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, let alone in a difficult context like Sudan and a difficult time like now. We're talking about initiatives that diaspora communities can lead. Do you think there is a room for these initiatives to directly target the problem of gender inequality and support female-founded companies?
Absolutely. So just a bit of context. I found myself in Tanzania a few years ago, almost a decade now. And as an African diaspora, I was in a country that I didn't know much about, but I saw a lot of similarity to the country I was born and raised in before I moved to the US. And I was in this rural village, and I was part of a program, the US program, maybe some of you are familiar, the Peace Corps. And it was just kind of one of those things where it was a very traditional approach to development. This is how it's done, very Western, come in, build a school, throw a few dollars here and there. But when I spent time in the village, I realized a really big barrier a lot of the women were facing was access to, financial independence. And there was, similar to Sudan, there's just so much that is happening and going on. You have mangoes falling from the tree, you have resources, rivers. I mean, there's just so much that for the first time, I became this entrepreneurial person, which I have no entrepreneurial background, but I saw solutions to the problems And it was not until my next door neighbor passed away from malaria that I realized that this is just very traumatizing. Then later, my grandmother passed away in Sudan, and then my aunt, and then her husband. And just seeing so many people very close to me who were affected by preventable illnesses, and the solutions were just right there in their own backyards. That's when I started Inua Naturals, which was an agribusiness company. And at the time, it was just something that I wanted to do locally through the support that I got from the women to really help them generate money and create these products. And it was essentially just skincare, body care, whatever that they had from their own indigenous traditional knowledge. And not until a year and a half in, I realized, we're kind of hitting a wall here. We're creating these incredible products. And this is when I realized the beauty of being a diaspora, being able to navigate all these multiple spaces. And I was like, well, wow, I can take this and bring it to the US. And then I did exactly that. I came back to the US after 2, 3, 4, I think it was 3.5 years. I bridged that gap. We started selling at Whole Foods. I started connecting them with boutiques in the area that I was living in. And all of a sudden, these women in a small village in Tanzania had access to a global market. And it was something so simple and not even, I didn't even get a lot of funding in the beginning because I didn't know the ins and outs of how a lot of this stuff works. And I then went to Sudan in 2019, part of the transitional period. And I saw how something like Inua Naturals could easily happen in Sudan. And frankly, I actually saw a lot of people doing the same exact thing in Sudan, but the only disconnect is that they didn't have access to the global market. And that's when I realized if you're able to connect a diaspora person, how I found myself in a rural village somewhere, and kind of bridge those gaps, it became this very, interesting, amplified approach. And I tried to integrate this part of my work with UNICEF when I was there, of how do we transition outside of the traditional funding market into tapping into the private sector in Sudan. And that was for the first time in Sudan's history that you had international organizations realizing, okay, the power and the sustainability is only going to come from the people of the country and those who have an emotional connection to the country. And then COVID happened. And when COVID hit, it was the Sudanese diaspora and the private sector in Sudan who funded $3 million just like that in a time span of a month to help combat COVID-19. That was more money than UNICEF was getting from the German government and other governments. That's when this kind of new narrative emerged of like, wow, it's a Sudanese diaspora, it's the local Sudanese people who are able to mobilize themselves to able to solve their own issues. So when it comes to women entrepreneurship in general and how these women can access resources, I realized that us as investors or people who are just interested in Sudan, it was the women who are in the front lines. It was when I went to Darfur, it was the women who were leading all of the all of this like innovation solution. It was women in Kordofan that were building solar cars when fuel was cut off and they weren't able to access, get to school. When you go to Kassala, it's women farmers who are actually dominating the farming industry. Women are essentially in the forefront. And if you truly want to transform an economy in a country like Sudan, you really do need to invest in women and women entrepreneurs, because they are the ones who have access, not only raising families, they're the ones reinvesting in their family, they're the ones reinvesting in their community. So it's really a call to investors. It's a call to everyone who is looking at the landscape of Sudan. You would need to prioritize women because they are the ones who are driving the community and driving the economy forward. And it's as simple as that, because there's enough evidence, enough data that shows when you invest in women, 90% of that money they're generating is going right back into the community, as opposed to men, which is about 30%. So when you look at all of this data that's available, it only makes business sense to invest in more women entrepreneurs and more women businesses and creating more resources for them.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Abir, for reiterating this extremely important message. And I just want to add to your point that this is something that can be very targeted, and once people who want to invest in the Sudanese ecosystem, starting from the diaspora, realize the importance of specifically investing in women, it needs to be very targeted. It needs to be very explicit. So thank you for reminding us of that. I think we're We're nearing the end of our panel, and then we're gonna go to audience Q&A. But I just want us to have a positive, inspiring note. And so, Hussam, I'll hand over to you because you have been working with 249 startups as a strategic advisor. You're seeing what's happening on the ground now in Kasala, in Al-Gadarif, how people are still resilient and working through everything that's going on now. What can you tell the people who are kind of not very connected to the context, who want to help um, and who want to contribute about what's happening now? How do you see the ecosystem adapting to the situation?
Thank you for that, Shimaa. Maybe I can also just say thank you to 249 Startups for providing me with this opportunity to work with you guys. I tell many of my friends I checked out from watching the news 3 or 4 years ago just because it's also doom and gloom. But the news I do get from day to day is the news from 249 Startups and the brilliant entrepreneurs that we're in communication with. And that's always quite positive. I think it's important to note that even prior to the war, Sudan was one of the most difficult operating environments in all of Africa, if not the world. So if you are a Sudanese business and you have been in business for quite some time, then you are resilient. And that has been even more so the fact today, right now. I think they all have exceptional difficult operating hurdles. I'm quite بصراحة just very proud to see many people continuing to be committed to doing business in Sudan. There are, I think, as Majdi said at some point, the flip side to these problems is opportunities, right? And many people are flocking to fill these opportunities in. You can imagine, for example, a large company that manufactured soap and detergent. Their factories are now stopped. I came across an entrepreneur through 249 Startups that has a small business manufacturing small soaps and detergents. That business is now thriving. There are ways to do business in Sudan, but you have to change away from the traditional model of how you did things. I think in an old Sudan, you could be a business, a large family group, and focus on doing 20 lines of business. That becomes very difficult today. The space is for you to go in and to focus on something actionable that also meets the market demands. And you can do it in a sustainable way. If you are in agriculture or anything to do with food, there is a great need for you today to be operating and active in Sudan. And you also can't be doing this while based remotely. I think that's quite difficult. I think the models that we found that work quite well is people that continue to be able to travel and to be at least part-time based out of Gadaref, Kasada, Port Sudan, areas where there is no conflict and where they can be of support to the local communities and to hire local, right? I'm sure lots of businesses have had to scale down, but every job that you create allows for you to provide or support another family behind that. And I think if there is one advice I've come across, also just working together with the team for the SME Sudan SME catalyzer, is just, I know it sounds difficult, especially sitting in this place of comfort, but just to have more patience with the processes, because processes can be quite long and tedious. At least if you're going to be applying for a grant, you need to know that the journey is long. It won't help even if you wanted to do even if you wanted to come immediately, will not come that directly. You need to have patience. You need to have done your homework. You need to have a good business plan. I know some people might not have financials or at least up-to-date financials, but at least come to the table with something, come prepared, and have the stamina to go through the process. And if you are able to do that, then support is on the way. I think that's maybe a longer answer to it, but just asking for more from the people, more resilience, and more of what they've been doing so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hussam, and thank you for also pointing out to the SME Catalyzer. I'm sure a lot of the audience members here would know about it, but it's a fund that is dedicated to helping companies to rebuild and to reestablish their presence after being affected by the conflict. So I want us to be actionable and practical in the end of this panel. So when the war stops, inshallah, what is the first thing that you will do as leaders in the diaspora communities that you're part of, as leaders in the impact investing or impact ecosystems, if you have the power to do anything after the war stops, what would it be? Let's limit this to 1 minute, and I'll start with you, Magdi.
Well, that's a great question. So I would put it in 2 or 3 different things. For 249, and for those of us who are interested in seeing entrepreneurs and innovators playing a bigger role in the economy, I would hope that there'd be some work that 249 would do around advocacy for the right framework, the right openness, the right environment to be set for those who want to come back and start businesses. It should be easy and simple and as friction-free as possible to go back and start. The businesses that one would, think about, a lot needs to be done in somewhat, sort of fundamental things, agribusiness, technology, the ability to move money in and out. We're very constrained now in being able to send money to Sudan. It's expensive. But within Sudan also, there's a lot of informality in that. And that can be addressed. And there are companies that are already starting to do that. And I would also focus on how do we mobilize not only, donor funding, but there need to be some risk sharing set up to attract capital initially. But also how do we mobilize other resources, particularly private resources, to back an entrepreneurial takeoff in Sudan? Because I think as I was saying earlier, the fact that you now have so many young entrepreneurs who are getting exposure throughout the region, and we've always been connected to the GCC and the Arabs, بنتكلم عربي, what we read and what we speak, but when you think about also the connection to Africa, I see Sudanese in Tanzania and Rwanda, the places we focus, Uganda. There are very vibrant places now for tech startups, and they'll come back with those skills. So I would want to connect with them and see how we can build together in this new environment, bringing their networks and skills with them.
Thank you very much, Hind.
I think, I won't claim to know what is going to be needed. I think after the war, I think everyone has been through a very, very difficult time. And I think moving back to Sudan, reopening business is going to be very challenging. So I think the first thing I would do is first, talk to organizations like 249 Startups and other organizations that are on the ground to better understand what is actually needed in terms of support. And maybe speaking to some entrepreneurs that are there on the ground and understanding what are their needs. And then maybe there's, an effort that should be made, and not by one single person, but a collective effort by a community from the diaspora. I mean, this panel is about the diaspora and how the diaspora can support. And I don't think one individual can necessarily make a difference, but maybe a collective group of individuals can come together and make a positive change in some way or form. But I won't pretend to know exactly what that support will be at that time. It might be funding, it might be grants, it might be a change of narrative, as Abir said, to help investors start to invest back, right? But it won't be the traditional investors that are looking for return on investment, but it might be impact investors, it might be NGOs and United Nations organizations. And how do we, talk about the new narrative, talk about the new vision for Sudan, and collectively try and encourage investment from these organizations back into the country. But I don't think Hind alone can do something, but potentially as a collective group, the diaspora or a group from the diaspora can come together and make a positive change after listening and to what is actually needed on the ground. So, if 249 can play a role in that, I welcome that, and I look forward to that, and I, would love to play a part in that some way or form.
Thank you very much, Hind. This is such a humble answer, and it's very, very important to get the ideas from the people who are on the ground and understand the needs properly. And of course, 249 startups will be at the forefront of initiatives and solutions. So please, everyone else in the attendees as well, reach out to 249 to get involved in efforts happening now and then, inshallah, after the war. Hussam?
I think a lot of the work is already being done today to ramp up towards that, right? Yeah, I think we're all some way dreaming, hoping that the war and this conflict will come to a conclusion sometime soon, right? And I think it's part of our duties to understand what are the gaps in the market, yeah, where are the opportunities, how can we already facilitate for businesses to easily start up, as Magdi was saying, to remove all the friction, to make it easier for them to restart. I think that's my short answer for that, right? I think we're all building towards something, and the work starts today, right? And it's continuing to go on up to a point where when the possibility is there, we can be ready. I think that's the best that we can do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The work does start now. And Abir?
Yeah, thank you. These are fantastic answers. And I've been reflecting on this the last almost 2 years now, is what can we do more? A lot of us have been affected directly or indirectly by this conflict. And even when I was in Sudan beforehand, one of the biggest things that continues to stand out to me, and kind of my plea to myself and to everyone who's listening to this and beyond, is really starting with ourselves. I think there's still a lot of internal work as an individual, as a Sudanese, of unlearning and relearning a lot of things. I was kind of, to my own surprise, didn't realize how many Sudanese people don't know enough about their own country, haven't traveled enough, haven't spent enough time to understand what Sudan is and what Sudan has and the heritage they have been a part of. So I feel like it really does start with us. And I feel like you can't just wait for some savior, some person or thing or entity to come and kind of make something happen. Sometimes I even see it now, as the war has unfortunately displaced so many of us. A lot of these, not the best ideas or narratives about our own selves and about our country are still upheld. So unlearning, relearning, understanding who we are, what Sudan has been, so many incredible things Sudan has been a part of, whether it's a anti-apartheid movement across South Africa, and how Nelson Mandela came to Sudan to learn about the resilient movement and how that helped him fight the fight in the southern part of the continent, whether it's Malcolm X. Sudan has always been very integral throughout global history. And it's not new for us. Rehabilitating and really driving this is not something that is new. It runs in our DNA. And more practical things, I think once we can finally return home, some initiatives have been ongoing that could resume, like the grassroots projects, kind of like adopting a school. I was born in Bahri. I went to school in Durman for a while. I lived in Beit al-Mal, I lived in Shambat. I kind of been all over. But I remember when I returned to my elementary school, I sat down with the principal that was there. This was 4 years ago. And she told me about these young Sudanese that were living in Saudi. They came back and they adopted their old school. And they completely rehabilitated the school. They brought new books, a new library. And I was like, well, this is a fantastic idea. So I went to my family. I said, why don't we do the same for the school that I went to? Because all of my siblings went there too. So we also did the same. And I thought to myself, this could be a fantastic national initiative. Adopt a hospital, adopt a roadway, adopt a school. We see these initiatives even here in the US. And this is an easy win for a lot of diaspora, because a lot of us can just say, you know what, I'm going to focus all of my investment and my money into maybe adopting a garden or a house or a hospital I was born in. And if you can only imagine if every single person adopted a school, whether in Kassala or, you know, in Dongula or in Khartoum or wherever you grew up, you can easily rehabilitate almost half of the country in no time. And it's just little things like that. If we can just think outside the box and become a little bit innovative, I think these can be easy wins, while the bigger systems that Magdi spoke about can start to come into place, kind of barriers, bringing in global investments, etc. But in the meantime, I think we can kind of tackle those smaller projects within the community. It's not new to Sudan, but doing it in a more structured way that can be a bit more cohesive and collective for the community.
Thank you very much. This is a very innovative way to contribute. Thank you so much, great panelists, and we look forward to questions from attendees. I see a lot of questions already coming in, and I see, thank you, Magdi, for already starting to answer these questions. So we can start with more kind of general questions, and then we go to the specific ones. And please, if you see a question that's directly directed to you, feel free to type the answer. And we can also, you can reach out to us afterwards if your question was not answered, and happy to answer if it's related to 249 or funding in general. So there was a question about a piece of advice for companies that were severely affected by the conflict, that the founders had to essentially be displaced, and they are now in new areas. How do they start? How do they establish their businesses again? So maybe Hussam, I can address this question to you. What would be some of the practical steps that such businesses can take, both
Thank you for
inside
that.
and out?
Yeah, I think many of the businesses that were already based in Sudan have suffered great losses. Either they've had most or all of their assets wiped out, if not a majority of them. The decision to relocate or not to relocate back to Sudan and to restart their business is not an easy question, right? You need to, because it does require commitment, and you can't have cold feet. You can't be 1 foot in, 1 foot out. You have to be really fully committed and really believe that you can do this. And I think that in of itself is quite a big ask to ask from someone. I think, as I was trying to highlight in my previous answer, if you want to be in Sudan doing business, you have to be there on the ground. You should at least try to focus on one line of business. If you were doing 2 or 3 or 4, just focus on something more critical. What is your bread and butter? What can you do really well? What is your minimum viable product that you can really do with excellence? And to focus on something that Sudan in the current stages really does need, right? If you are in agriculture, if you are in food, I think those are dire necessities. Some basic consumer goods. We're talking about, soaps, detergents, oils. All of these basic commodities are necessary. And if you also in import export, I think you'll also find that there's plenty of room for you to do a good job. And as much as you can, try to reach out and look and explore, because there are grants out there to support businesses like you that want to be back in Sudan. It's in the global interest of not only just Sudan, but also our other partner countries or the EU in general to support these businesses, because more businesses flourishing in Sudan means more people staying in Sudan, being vibrant in Sudan, right? And just when you do look at these resources, one of them could be the Sudan SME Catalyzer, is just, as I said, to have patience, right? And to understand that it's not that there will be quite a lot of long sessions and questions being asked and documents that are required. It's always part of the process, and that's how it goes. But and I can only just say I admire you a lot for wanting to do this. It's not an easy ask, and it's something that requires quite a lot of courage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A question for Magdi about the perceived risk about Sudan. Mahmoud Khalil is asking, are there alternative investment models that are alternative to the traditional venture models that can help to de-risk and make Sudan more attractive to investors?
Okay, good question. There's a lot of people thinking about this. So, you know, I focus on Tanzania, Rwanda, Uganda, Ethiopia. We are all countries that don't get a lot of venture funding. And one of the reasons the traditional venture model, you know, where investors expect extremely high returns to take the risk. Some of the markets are small and it may not allow the kind of growth that, you know, markets in Africa tend to be fragmented. So for reasons of risk and for reasons of market size, sometimes, you know, the expectations of venture capital in other countries or the developed countries might not fit perfectly. But the basics, I want to be very clear that the basic idea that at each stage, because so the other questions related to this, at each stage as a venture grows, there's appropriate kinds of investors, initially angels, maybe family and friends, and then you get seed rounds and then A rounds and B rounds, et cetera. You're de-risking at each stage and the company's maturing, and so you expect a different valuation. That basic idea of how venture works is very appropriate because it's about managing risk at each stage. Now, can you do something other than that? Yes, so there's blended finance models. I think it'd be interesting to look at de-risking maybe the first investors, first investments that come into a new market to allow for familiarity, to allow that to take away that learning risk, you know. So once an investor has learned, maybe they'd be more inclined to invest without support. But you can, you know, you can do first loss. There are other, so essentially more involving some philanthropic capital while keeping people who are investors having skin in the game. So not to take away all the risk and not to move private investments out of the way by providing grants only, because that tends to distort the market. You get companies or startups that only seek grants and never make it commercially. So I think we can talk about blended models, but keeping the integrity and the incentives that make venture work.
Thank you so much. So we have a question.
By the way, just one last thing. So, you know, it's important to diversify. If some of the people here are investors, you know, diversify as well. So you should have some high risk part of your investments alongside other countries that may be a little bit more mature. So you should think about different ways you can de-risk by diversifying as well.
Yes, and thank you for bringing up the point about being dependent and reliant on grants. Hopefully grants can be used as catalytic capital, but not as the only form of capital.
Right.
There are a few questions about 249, and I'm so happy to see that a lot of people are joining for the first time 249 events. You please feel free to reach out to us on our social media accounts. I'm also going to put an email in the chat you can reach out to, and I'm happy to answer any question about 249. Focusing on this panel, Abir, I think there's a question for you. So the question is more kind of spiritual, philosophical, let's say, but a very, very important question. Muram is asking for someone who is focused on supporting women entrepreneurs who were affected by the conflict and are trying to either reoperate or start a business. What's the best approach to help rekindle the entrepreneurial spirit and motivate those women those women-owned businesses to thrive in or outside Sudan?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question and definitely not an easy one to answer. I would say good examples to learn from, and I think it's always really good to do our homework and research. And the first thing that comes to mind working within the UN system and also in the space that I'm in now is tapping into examples like Palestine, the Syrian refugees. They're really, really good examples of how people have been able to rebuild and restart in conflict zones. And sectors that are always more simple, not the easiest, but more simple, would be food delivery, agriculture. These are kind of the spaces you want to get into because you're more likely to how do you say, you're more able to kind of access something that is on the day-to-day, like what people use every day. And platforms you can use as active WhatsApp groups, Facebook, you see there's so many platforms out there to market your services. So I feel like you kind of have to start with the low-hanging fruits and learn from examples from around the world. I use Rwanda, Syria, Palestine. Myanmar is a really good example. There's a lot of women entrepreneurship initiatives. And I think when you start at that level of seeing what is, one example that comes to mind actually right now more concretely in Tanzania, when the genocide happened in Rwanda, there was a massive migration that happened from that region into the western part of Tanzania, and they settled there for years. And you could just see the vendors everywhere and women who are, just kind of like doing what they're able to do in the moment. And then little by little, these things start to scale up. And one of them was sanitary pads. We have really great examples of that in Sudan with the Salama factory. So it starts really small on the street, little by little, they start to grow, they saw more demand for it. And eventually, like what Hussam said, you have to have the stomach for it. Entrepreneurship is not an overnight success. It's really about long-term building. It's about shifting our mentality. It's about realizing that this is really essentially kind of like might not even be for us to see, but for the next generations to kind of reap the benefits. So it's really having that mindset of long-term investment, but start with what surveillance your community, see what's there, learn from other models. And I think that's really the best way to start something like that.
Thank you very much. Hind, I'll direct this question to you because you have been working in the diaspora community for a long time. You have a group that's focused on connecting diaspora members. So it's actually two questions, but we'll make them one question. How can young diaspora members get involved? So there's one question about a fresh graduate who wants to get involved, don't know how to start. And then there is another question about someone who's based in Vancouver and can't find members of the diaspora to connect to and work together with.
Okay, let's talk about the second question first. I think, finding ways to connect with the diaspora. I personally think that organizations like 249 are an excellent way, and tapping into 249 is an excellent way to actually get connected with the rest of the diaspora that is specifically interested in entrepreneurship, supporting SMEs, and other investors that are involved in this space. So I think that person should reach out to 249 startups and see how they can get involved and how they can support the ecosystem. I think in every country, there tends to be a Sudanese community of some kind, and these communities come together, and some people are very active in these communities and some people step away. So, if that person is interested in connecting with other Sudanese members, I think a starting point is to connect with the Sudanese community that is in country and see who else is interested in the space. And then the third thing I would say is, I always say, it's easy to sit in a country that is whatever, the US, the UK, but there's nothing like going on the ground and actually trying to connect there. Obviously, currently in Sudan, the situation is quite difficult to do that, but I think going to these large global events where you can potentially connect with other members of the diaspora, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Qatar, we have a lot of these kind of events, and the diaspora is quite connected as well. So tapping into these kind of hubs is one way to do it. And also Facebook groups. I mean, like We have a Facebook group. It's like 17,000 people. It's very active. There's other Facebook groups. Facebook's amazing. I mean, you know, people are very active. There's fantastic communities on there where people talk to each other and connect and become friends. And we'd love to take these communities and make them physical, but that's more difficult, I think, given the environment. So I think that, and then in terms of fresh grads, I would say don't be shy, knock on doors, leverage the network, reach out to people. You know, we tend to be quite shy and cautious with these things, but, you know, be aggressive. Go, you know, connect with people and offer your time, even if it's for free. You know, I've worked with a lot of interns and fresh grads. They've worked for free for 6 months, 12 months sometimes, but then it's ultimately led to a full-time opportunity because they've proven themselves, they've proven their ability, they've shown a willingness to learn and develop. So, you know, I think this is the, you know, some of the advice I would give. And also, you know, startups are a great place to train and develop and learn as well. So, you know, and startups need resources and they're tight on funding as well. So, you know, offer your resources and your time to a startup or an SME, whether it's in Sudan, whether it's in Egypt. It's a great way to learn. You get a lot of responsibility early on in your career. So those are great, you know, career opportunities for fresh grads. Don't always go for the big names and the big companies because, you know, they get 1,000 applications a day and it's very difficult. But actually a startup, a new startup or an SME, more willing to let you work with them, especially if the first few months are, you know, just to get on the ground. So that's the advice I would give.
Thank you very much. I hope this has been helpful for the two who asked the question. We have two, I would say, a bit heavy questions. So I'm going to keep it open and please feel free to jump in. The first question is about value-added ventures. So Iba is asking, we often hear about investments in basic jobs when it comes to diaspora funding in Sudan, but value-added ventures like manufacturing, technology, or sustainable industries can create more impact and long-term growth. But what can be done to shift the focus towards these type of ventures? How can we make them more attractive for diaspora investors? And are there specific policies or success stories that we can build on? Any volunteers?
Maybe I can begin to venture a beginning to that difficult question. I think there is value added currently happening in Sudan, right? It depends on what level of value added that you're talking about, right? Because I think the traditional image you probably have of Sudanese business is one that does import-export of raw agricultural produce. Yeah. And when you're talking about value added, you're talking about how can I turn that agricultural produce into something more value added so that I'm capturing more of that local value in Sudan. And it takes having a stable country to do something really powerful. But already with some of the businesses that I've been talking to through 249 startups, some of them are already involved in doing value added. That can be in manufacturing locally of agricultural equipment. That's capturing value locally instead of you having to import stuff from abroad. We also talked to a great company that's making peanut butter locally in Sudan. So that's not just taking the raw peanuts and exporting them and then importing back peanut butter. It's actually about doing local manufacturing in Sudan. I think to further support these businesses, you need to build clusters where these businesses can operate in safety, where they know that their investment in their assets is not going to be jeopardized down the line in a couple of months. I think that's not something that the entrepreneurship community can do alone, but will require even further support to do that. I'm not sure if that begins to answer that question, but at least it's the beginning of an answer. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, it definitely puts things into perspective. Yes, Majdi?
No, I thought it was a good answer. I agree with that, but I still like the premise of the question is that, sorry. The premise of the question is that manufacturing is adding value and maybe other things are not, or technology is not. So first of all, you're not going to get a sustainable business unless customers are willing to pay for it, and it needs to add value to them. You know, I like companies that are solving real problems for real people, that they're willing to pay that solution. And there's going to be a very big opportunity because there's so many gaps in the market that we're not being very well served in Sudan even before, and there'll be even more opportunity later. But there's sort of a company that is aggregating, you know, one of our investments is aggregating data around healthcare so that clinical trials and other things can happen. They're growing very quickly across Africa. But, you know, that's not manufacturing. The product is essentially data, but it's extremely value added. So I think one needs to have a broad perspective of how you solve a problem and think about information and think about, you know, I do think Sudan needs to build manufacturing and agriculture and all of those things. But for entrepreneurs that are going to be focused on asset light, and it'd be important to be asset light, especially post-conflict, because deploying large scale, long-term capital in a conflict environment is not going to be easy. But there are many asset light models that would work in a post-conflict situation. So don't think of those as not value added. I would be open-minded about how you create value.
Thank you both so much. I think we have space for one more question, and it's also a difficult one. The question is, given the prevalence of family businesses in Sudan, why is there a noticeable lack of family offices? I would say not lack, but basically they don't exist. Why is that the case? And why aren't these family businesses actively investing in startups or providing exit opportunities for entrepreneurs?
Maybe I can answer this a bit briefly from the perspective of my previous role, UNICEF private sector engagement and development in Sudan. And I would say that's not entirely true. I've worked a lot with, I mean, majority of private corporations in Sudan are family owned, whether it's DAL Group, whether it's CTC, etc. And it's kind of a very complicated conversation to have, but I've seen firsthand how they've always stepped in a lot of ways. I've used the COVID-19 response where they literally, you know, rolled out 3 million together. We also, in the last, I think it was in 2020, 2021, they created the public-private cooperation platform with the government, the transitional government at the time. So there's definitely a lot of effort that was happening, maybe not as mainstreamed. And to tie it to the previous question with manufacturing and how the Sudanese family-owned businesses were actually mobilizing and really trying, despite the landscape in Sudan, the business landscape, is the pumpy nuts, which was the therapeutic packages that they use for severely malnourished children at the UN. And we know that Sudan produces maybe nearly 80% of the global groundnut production. Yet we were purchasing almost 8 million worth of pumpy nuts every year from France, from Canada. And it was UNICEF and staff at UNICEF that said, well, why are we doing this? Why don't we collaborate with local businesses to do this? And this is where a factory was developed in Darfur, in East Darfur, that I visited myself to see that they started producing more than 90% of plum peanuts locally. That started going to Niger, started going to other UNICEF offices in the region, which was a good example. So I feel like there's definitely a lot of effort, but there were not very clear mechanisms or structures for entrepreneurs in Sudan to have access to these opportunities. But I would say there was definitely a lot of that happening. It was just a matter of how do we kind of make it clear for everyone to know, okay, this is how much Hajjab Group was investing in this. This is how much CTC was investing in this. We're actually doing a lot of work. And I've seen how they were also trying to create these entrepreneurship competitive spaces with UNDP, with the UN. But unfortunately, I don't feel like it was as mainstreamed as we wanted it to be. And we really tried to make it. But you know, everything kind of happened the way it did towards the end of the transition. How we can learn from this example as we move forward, and how as Sudan recovers and kind of rehabilitates in the next few steps, is really tapping into a little bit more with the private sector and strengthening those partnerships. I think there's a lot of emphasis and focus on international cooperation with local cooperation, which is important, but also we needed to strengthen the collaboration locally because there's so much that was happening, but it was all very fragmented. And I think a platform like 249 is really well positioned to do that. It's really building those connections and those bonds. And I mean, even now, as the war is ongoing, there's still so many private sector and businesses who are mobilizing in Sudan. So it's a matter of really connecting those dots. And I feel like 249 can really continue to do the incredible work that they are to connect those, you know, build those bridges.
Thank you very much, Abir. I think this is a very good way to end this discussion. And I'm really sorry for the few questions that we weren't able to get to. I just posted a few resources in the chat. I posted the 249 Facebook page. Please follow our page if you're not already. You will also hear more about events like this. As I mentioned earlier, there is a panel again tomorrow about investment. There is an investment readiness training as well. You can find information about it on the Facebook page. If you have specific questions or you want to speak to us, I also put our email in the chat. We also have 2 hubs in Sudan, the Spear Business Center in Kassala and Insan in Port Sudan. So feel free to reach out to us physically as well in Sudan. And yeah, I just want to thank the panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you, Hind, Magdi, Hussam, and Abir. This was a very insightful conversation. I gained a lot of new information, and I got very, very inspired talking to you, and I'm sure everyone in the audience agrees with this. Thank you so much. And just to remind everyone, everyone in the panel said that they are happy to help and volunteer their time, answer your questions. So if you have specific questions, I'm also reminding you that you can reach out to any of us. And again, I added the resources to 249 specifically in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
Shimaa.
Have a
Thank
nice
you,
day.
everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Inshallah.
Bye.
Bye.